As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
And I realized I was concerned as to whether this law was beneficial or not beneficial to low-income people. They were concerned because this law was providing 1/3 of the income of the U.S. Department of Labor. And once you begin to see that the government agencies have their own self-interest, quite aside from whatever they're theoretically supposed to be doing.
So they were behaving precisely as a neoclassical, precisely as Milton Friedman would have predicted. They were in pursuit of their own incentives.
That's right.
They were not trying to establish justice on the face of the earth. They were trying to hold on to pretty good jobs.
Yes.
Got it.
But one summer in the government was enough to let me say, no, this government is really not the answer. I mean, that is...
Milton Friedman didn't cure you, but the federal government did.
The federal government did.
So
never say the federal government doesn't do anything.
All right, so the next one here, the UK says that NATO should consider waiving Ukraine membership plan. So British Defense Minister Ben Wallace said Thursday that NATO should consider skipping a member action plan as a requirement for Ukraine to join the Western Military Alliance. So the membership action plan is designed to ensure that aspiring NATO members meet certain political, economic, and military standards to join the alliance. Waiving the MAP, the abbreviation for it, would speed up Ukrainian membership if NATO ever formally invites Kiev to join. According to the UK Parliament's House of Commons library, between 1990 and 2020, every new NATO member joined through the MAP. That's how they got in. They started with that. It was a long process, and then they joined. But recently, Finland and Sweden, they were invited to join NATO last year without having to go through that process. And we know Finland's a member now, and Sweden is not yet, and has more issues with Turkey now, so who knows when they will join. But that's kind of the argument coming from the British. So Ben Wallace said, quote, "I think we should absolutely look at skipping the membership action plan. But of course, we have to put some realism in this space that there are 31 members of NATO now, and we all have to move together," end quote. Right, the next one here, the Pentagon says that the Chinese balloon did not collect data in the United States. So the Pentagon said Thursday that the Chinese balloon that wound up over the U.S. in February did not collect data while it flew over U.S. territory. And the White House has acknowledged that these three objects that they shot down after the Chinese balloon were likely totally benign, as that's how the White House put it. Biden said that it was likely balloons tied to private companies, recreational or research institutions, studying weather or conducting other scientific research. So totally harmless things that it's very normal for them to be floating around. And the U.S. went out and shot them down with these missiles. And man, I mean, that's $1.6 million in missiles. That doesn't account for the cost of fuel and sending the planes up and all that. So again, you just see how dangerous. So 21 organizations have sent a letter to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin calling for the Pentagon to conduct a transparent investigation into a May 3rd drone strike that killed a civilian in northwest Syria's Idlib province. When the strike was first launched, U.S. Central Command claimed that it killed a senior al-Qaeda leader, but there was there was immediate indications that a civilian was hit that day. I wrote up a story about that because there was evidence that it looked like they killed a civilian. Pentagon officials later told CNN that CENTCOM did not know who they killed when they made the claim. So they lied about it. The victim of the drone strike turned out to be 56-year-old Lotfi Hassan Misto, a father of 10, who was killed while herding his sheep in the Idlib countryside. Relatives and neighbors said he had no affiliation with al-Qaeda or any militant group, and terrorism experts told the Washington Post there was no evidence that he did. So this letter was signed by a lot of organizations, including Amnesty International and Air Wars, which is the monitoring group that keeps track of a lot of U.S. airstrikes and drone strikes that kill civilians. And they're calling on the Pentagon to conduct a robust investigation into the strike. The Pentagon has announced a probe into the incident, but previous investigations into strikes that killed civilians have claimed no wrongdoing and did not result in any accountability. Specifically, the one I linked to here is the August 29th, 2021 drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 civilians, slaughtered a whole family, 7 children were killed. Pentagon investigated it, found no wrongdoing, and nobody was fired or demoted or punished or anything. So these groups want the investigation to be transparent and released to the public. And they also called for the U.S. to make amends for the strike. The next one here, Netanyahu drops key clause in judicial overhaul. This article is from Middle East Eye. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dropped a central part of his government's judicial overhaul, but will still push ahead with the reforms. So in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he said that the government would no longer seek to grant the Knesset, Israel's parliament, the authority to overturn Supreme Court rulings. So he said he threw that out. And that was the big thing, as far as I understand, because that would have given, again, with a simple majority, anything the Supreme Court said, the Knesset could, throw it out. That's a pretty major, big power, big shakeup of government power. He said, quote, "I threw that out. I already changed a few things right after the original proposal was put forward. The way of choosing judges is not going to be the current structure, but it's not going to be the original structure," end quote. So it's not clear. He said he would still keep and push other elements in the overhaul. Israelis have launched mass protests since January, very vague protests over the reforms, which they say would weaken the judiciary and turn the Supreme Court into a pseudo political body that would bend laws in favor of government.
There's a lot that indicates that Vladimir Putin is very popular in Russia. Now, I don't know exactly how much this war has affected that. Wars do tend to be unpopular, especially the longer they go and the bloodier they are. But what would be able to say, kind of like, if you have if you have factions within Russia who love Vladimir Putin and factions who hate Vladimir Putin, what would be more likely to pull that all together? Like a peaceful dove or an authoritarian strongman? Well, history would tell us that an authoritarian strongman is more likely to come out of that. And, when you're dealing with a country that has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the history of the world, to just be like celebrating that we're rolling the dice on this is insane to me. I mean, look, Vladimir Putin is at least the devil we know. You know what I mean? Like, the world's been dealing with Vladimir Putin since Bill Clinton was in office. Or was it Clinton? Maybe it was after. It was after Clinton, but whatever. It's been a long time. It's been 20 years or so of dealing with Vladimir Putin. Okay, yes, he's had military operations in Georgia, in Syria, and of course this war in Ukraine. It's not great. I would argue they were all responses to Western aggression, but it's like, don't think it couldn't be worse, and like, whatever people can caricature this as, I'm sure there will be idiots who caricature this as, this is pro-Putin talking points, but it's like, no, to say you shouldn't topple the German monarchy is not a pro-monarchy talking point. It's just like, look, Adolf Hitler rose up next. That was worse. If you think it can't get any worse than this, you're incredibly naive, and you're rolling the dice with the biggest nuclear power in the world. No, you make a great point, and just to add more names to the list, I mean, like in terms of opposing NATO expansion, Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, all took the same approach. I think what really happened is that the neoconservative and neoconservative leaning members, they won out, and they defeated the ones who were warning against this. And I do think part of it is that the incentives of government just kind of line up so that if you're advocating expanding the power, everybody around you is making a lot more money.
Yes.
And if you're advocating reducing or limiting the power, everyone around you is making less money. And so this is just, I mean, it's really what happened is that the neoconservatives had this vision which they laid out in the Project for a New American Century. They said, we're going to remake the Middle East and we're going to expand NATO all the way to Russia's borders. And this way, the Middle East will be loyal to us. We can do business with them, and Russia won't be a European power. And this made a lot of private state connected actors filthy freaking rich. And so there was just a lot more support for them. But you're right, at this point, it's almost like, even when some of those guys are still around, I mean, Bill Burns, who's the head of the CIA, he wrote the Niet means Niet memo, which was warning that if we pursue NATO, Ukrainian entry into NATO, this is going to lead to what we have today. But even he doesn't seem to have anything to say about it now. It's like they all just kind of put the blinders on and went, nope, we were right about everything. And history began when Vladimir Putin invaded, and we can't look at any of that other stuff.
We're not just railing against wokeness or the pro-war establishment or whatever. Like there's a time and place for that. But here's an affirmative vision of our own. That's what we're running to. And I think I'm not even reinventing that. I'm reinventing the ideals enshrined in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. Why don't we revive that as not reverting to the past? All I'm doing is framing that as the future. But actually, the rest of the statute that still lives on includes provisions that say the president can reorganize agencies, including shutting down agencies, if they either promote the economy or reflect redundancies amongst the existence of multiple government agencies that don't exist. That is what I will use to shut down the U.S. Department of Education, which should not exist, spends $80+ billion a year. That I will use to shut down the FBI, spends $11 billion a year, when there's plenty of arguments for redundancy in the federal government there as well, the U.S. Marshals and so on, carrying out most of the same functions. To go down the list, the ATF, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, possibly the entire Department of Energy as we know it, the CDC, will go down the list. I'm actually statutorily empowered to do it. One of the things that stops you is if it's not the civil service protections. Oh, by the way, they'll say that, there's civil service protections that you can't use to fire people. Well, hold the phone. It actually was pretty clear that what it was doing was preventing the political retribution of a U.S. president towards a civil servant. But on its own terms, those statutes do not apply to mass firings, mass layoffs, which require only 60-day notice. So it requires a president that has a level of understanding of the detail to have the conviction to see that through when an advisor otherwise says, oh, your hands are tied and you can't do it. I don't buy that. And I've built multi-billion-dollar businesses not listening to people from the managerial ranks telling me what I can and cannot do before getting to truth. Get to the truth of the matter. Be guided by that rather than what somebody whispered in your ear, because then you're just a puppet.
Did you happen to catch, there was a real interesting moment last year when the Trilateral Commission met in Japan, and there was like this crazy rowdy group of different representatives from Asian countries. I'm talking allies, South Koreans, Japanese, who were furious about the how provocative the U.S. is being toward China. And I would just suggest that if we're talking about negotiating these things away, much like you were talking about negotiating with Vladimir Putin, there's also many things that where we could stop performing war games right off of their coast. We could stop having our State Department, and one of Trump's final moves from his State Department, labeling them as committing a Uyghur genocide, which was, by the way, listed one single source, Adrian Zenz, which was all like doctored bad numbers. I'm not saying they're treating the Uyghurs great, but the data that they provided, that Pompeo put out, was like just not accurate. Even I believe Zenz has admitted that himself. But I also think there's probably, the stuff like Joe Biden saying we will militarily defend Taiwan, which is just, look, none of us want to see China invade Taiwan. But the idea that America is going to go over there and militarily defend Taiwan if they're invaded is goofy. It just makes no sense. It's like saying China would stop us from invading Mexico City. It's not going to happen. You can't do it. We're two countries with a whole lot of H-bombs, and we're not going to move. Even in our own war games, we lose that war. So I just think there's probably room to negotiate with China by also saying, like, you can take this kind of harder path economically, but also saying that, like, to back off of some of the provocations that I think both Obama, Trump, and the Biden administration have been guilty of.
Second distinction I would draw, and this is going to, this will get me in a lot of trouble in the Republican Party, but it's just my true belief. I think our commitment to Taiwan, let's just be really honest, is fundamentally and ought to be fundamentally different if we're semiconductor supply chain independent, period. I mean, you got Samsung, you got South Korean companies, you've got building and construction going on here in the United States. We're a matter of years from getting there. I personally think that China, depends on Xi Jinping's motivation. If it's to screw over the United States economically, then he has an incentive to go sooner. But I think this is more of a nationalistic impulse dating back to 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek, was fundamentally hostile to now what the recognized ruling regime in China is, which is the Communist Party. If that's really what it is, he's going to possibly wait until we actually have semiconductor independence in this country, because he will predict, hopefully correctly, and if I'm president, it will be correctly, that we don't have a reason to engage in a way that we would if our own economic security depended on it from the semiconductor supply chain. So I think that that's an interesting insight that no one's talking about here. And I'll come back to saying that here's how I want to do it. I think that and it's achievable, right? So this is not la la land stuff. Pull Russia apart from China. If Taiwan wants to, we certainly can export our ideas and help turn itself into a porcupine with its own version of the Second Amendment, re-enter the trade relationships with Japan, South Korea, et cetera. Part of what they were frustrated about as well that they're venting about was our absence of trading with them in Japan. And then put ourselves in a position to say that, hey, listen, if you're not going to play by the same set of rules, we're not going to play your game economically. I think this gets us there. And I think I'm the only person in this race, and part of the reason I'm in it, who has a clear vision and a clear set of steps to deter or avoid war over Taiwan and end the war in Ukraine, all the while actually advancing American interests.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
79% probability of a July rate rise in the United States. You ready? Even Bank of Japan Governor, Mr. Fucking Shit, said growth of wages was picking up in his country. Quote, wages have started to rise at 2% so far for the first time in more than 3 decades. So fuck the people. Fuck the people. How dare you get 2% more? Hey, how much did Gates get? What about Buffett? What about Bezos? What about the billionaires that got $27 trillion richer during the COVID war? How about fuck off, Salenti? And if you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral as well as unjust, said St. Thomas Aquinas. So fuck off, because I'm angry. And that's proper language. When you're in a fight for your life, please don't rob and steal from me or kill me. Grow the fuck up. Anyway, that's on your interest rate front. Here we go. Lagarde tells ECB to keep rates high. Yep. This is a Lagarde that said that there was no inflation. No inflation. No, it's just all in your mind. We're fixing it. And they made up that 2% inflation number, by the way, in 2012. They made the fucking number up. Fed economists say historic 37% of U.S. companies are in big trouble, and one that could worsen the fallout from fighting inflation. That's right. The higher interest rates go, the worse things are going to get. Again, this is from the Federal Reserve, so I'm not making this up. Yep. The higher they raise interest rates, the worse things are going to get. You ready for this? Disenchanted Portland residents leave the city. Cities across the U.S. are contending with an urban exodus that came with the COVID-19 pandemic. Americans moved to more affordable areas, to the suburbs and countryside, and they sought more space to work increasingly from home and get away from crime and violence. So here's the bullshit that came with the COVID-19 pandemic. Hey, Zerusa Ellison, who wrote this for the Wall Street Journal, you're full of fucking shit. You're full of fucking shit. It's the scumbag politicians that locked down the fucking country, the states and the cities. And maybe you're too fucking stupid to read the Trends Journal because we forecast this was going to happen. When people lose everything and have nothing left to lose, they lose it. We warned about rising crime. We warned about businesses going bust as more people work from home, commuted, and office occupancy rates and vacancy rates would rise. Totally blacklisted by the mainstream media. And it wasn't a fucking pandemic, prick. Or I don't know if you can't say the other word. They called it a pandemic in 2020 of March when only a couple of thousand people died. And 99.91% of the people are still alive. And your cover from your Trends Journal, 106 dead in China, 1.4 billion still alive. That was 2 weeks after the Chinese launched the COVID war, January 28th, 2020. Commission, the European Commission, a bunch of fucking scumbags. We're the European Commission. We suck up and bow down to anybody to get where we are. And we'll tell you what to do. Digital currency. We warned about this 3 years ago in your Trends Journal. More than 3 years ago, March 2020, from dirty cash to digital trash. They'll know every penny you spent, where you spent it, and what you spent it on. May 29th. What is that? 6 weeks ago? How many weeks ago is that? 6 weeks ago or something? This is from Business Insider. Former Russian commander in Ukraine says Putin could be overthrown by the Wagner mercenary army. Nobody's talking about this. This is predicted. Former federal security officer said Putin could be overthrown by Wagner, ousted by the private military group, the Wagner Army, according to Igor Girkin, former federal security service officer who once led a group of Russian militants in Donetsk. Girkin is also known by his allies as Strelkov and is now a prominent war blogger. Quote, if Prigozhin, whatever his name is, Prigozhin, any direction, the guy the head of Wagner, remains the head of Wagner, the mutiny will come quickly and radically. A coup attempt has been declared. There you got it. This is important, barely reported. European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee called for the European Union to help the International Criminal Court to prosecute Israel for war crimes in a resolution on EU-Palestinian relations. This happened on Tuesday, barely reported. The committee also called to consider target EU measures specifically addressing settlement expansion in the West Bank. Expansion, stealing land. Great. The United States is sending its largest nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea for the first time in 4 decades. Isn't that wonderful? How about if China sent their nuclear submarines to the Gulf of Mexico? This is none of our business. And that's why I launched Occupy Peace. Millions are under air quality alerts. That's the other big news because of the fires up in Canada. You're fighting all these fucking wars and you can't put out a fucking fire. Trillions of dollars in wars and you can't put out a fucking fires. You got that arrogant little Trudeau up there, the little daddy's boy. Justin Trudeau, an arrogant, my daddy was Pierre. I'm Andy Cuomo. My daddy was Mario when we're renaming the Tappan Zee Bridge. I'm little Georgie Bush with a dick smaller than a pencil. My daddy was George Bush. My grandpa was Prescott Bush. Who was your grandfather? Oh, my grandfather, my mother's side, may rest in peace, was a laborer on the George Washington Bridge. My other grandfather worked in a fish store. You nothing. You weren't a member of the club.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Well, and not to mention his father goes out of his way to say it's about time on Twitter to say it's about time the rich pay their fair share. Well,
yeah.
Physician, heal thyself.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it's fascinating that Joe Biden's piety routine never had any credibility with anybody who's been paying attention to anything since the Nixon administration. That was when Joe Biden came to power in D.C. in the Senate. And it's like he's always talked a bunch of trash to be this pious guy, and he's always been a weasel. But the media, in order to help Biden defeat Trump, bought into this storyline of Biden being a progressive reformer. You know, he's very experienced. You know, it's too bad he can't find his way on and off the stage, but otherwise he's very experienced.
Yeah, that seems to be our situation. But the thing is, up to now, though, Jim, people in the media and elsewhere in the culture would make excuses for Biden pretty consistently. But for some reason now, it seems like it's almost become legitimate to ask questions. So do you think that's because the appearance of wrongdoing has become simply so obvious that it's no longer plausible to play the old pretend everything's fine game? Or is this, as some people suspect, a plot afoot to try to disrupt his candidacy to try to get a more effective candidate in his place? I mean, I suppose who can really know?
Well, it's possible that it's both. It's been amusing to see how the media has worked very hard to avoid the evidence of profound federal misconduct, not just in the Biden case, but if you look at the censorship stuff by the Homeland Security, the FBI, a lot of other agencies, and the news media has basically embraced a National Lampoon definition of censorship that if there's not a photo of an FBI agent holding a gun to a Twitter employee's head, then the FBI did not use too much pressure. So, but as far as Biden goes, I think these whistleblowers have kind of broken the dam, as you said. But it's interesting. There was an article in the Washington Post last October 6th that said that the Justice Department was very close to bringing criminal charges against Hunter Biden. And apparently on the following day, there was a huge uproar at the meeting of the U.S. Attorney's Office. I think it was in Delaware. Probably a lot of shouting. It'd be wonderful if someone had a tape recording of that meeting. But that was where it may have been that Merrick Garland's people kind of put their thumb down and yanked in the reins. And ever since last October, folks have been thinking, well, are the charges going to drop this day? Then all of a sudden, a week or so ago, we find out, well, it's all settled. It's a plea agreement, 0 jail time, smack on the wrist, and he pays $9 back to the IRS. There was apparently a handful of journalists, I guess mostly broadcast people probably, buy into the poor Hunter Biden, he's an addict, suffering addict storyline the Biden people were putting out. But, you know, that's a load of crap.
Well, I think what's happened here is that the image they've created about Trump as being a uniquely and overwhelmingly wicked figure who needs to be stopped at all costs, I think they felt like that would give them cover for almost anything they might want to do. Because, hey, look, you don't want Trump back, do you? And the only thing standing between you and Trump is the Democratic Party. You don't want that to happen. So I think the insinuation is don't ask questions and let the professionals do their job.
Well, let the professionals do their job. Yeah, that's a line that would go well in quite a few Washington tombstones.
Trust the science.
Trust the science. Yeah, even better, even better. You know, well, it's worked out well for Fauci. He's going to Georgetown University. So getting $100,000 a speech, you know, I mean, okay, $100,000 a speech is not as much as you or I make, but still, it's pretty good money.
You know, someday he'll get into Bovard and Woods speaking fee territory, but all this is, but he's actually getting a position at Georgetown?
Yes. I don't know if it's a visiting fellow or something, but Georgetown University. So, but I think that they've had a number of war criminals in the past.
But did you know that Lori Lightfoot got a fellow position at Harvard? She was the mayor of Chicago.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes, I heard about that. And I was thinking, you know, Harvard has outdone themselves.
Oh, I know. But in particular, when you hear what it's in leadership and health. Now, in health, the quote leadership she demonstrated was literally following what everybody else did. That was her leadership, was to do exactly what every other blue city mayor did. That's leadership these days.
She was actually worse than most of them because of the kind of rhetoric and with the riots after the George Floyd killing. I mean, Chicago is one of the worst places in the country as far as just widespread damage, especially in low-income neighborhoods. I mean, there was a meeting between the mayor and the aldermen, the city council, more or less, and it was during the heights of the violence, and there were these aldermen, male and female, just in tears at how their neighborhoods were being destroyed by the rioters and the looters. And this is in South Chicago, where they had begged CVS and begged Walmart to come in for years, and they'd finally come in. And then everything's being destroyed. And mayor says, well, you know, I don't know what she said, but it was basically all nonsense.
It's rough and tumble, but usually the market wins out after a lot of pain and suffering occurs, and usually wipes out a lot of people. Say, hey, we better think, what do we want? Maybe we ought to consider those crazy ideas of sound money once again. Chris?
Very good, Dr. Paul. Yes, today we're focusing on CBDCs, which are central bank digital currencies, yet another utopian scheme. But, as our founders warned at the very beginning, you must be vigilant if you cherish your freedom, because authoritarians will always have a new scheme coming at you one after another. Some are bigger than others. We just went through a big one that failed, those vaccine passports, where the idea was that we were all going to be constantly jabbed every so few months and then have to prove with our phones that we were jabbed in order to participate in society. And they were trying this in New York City, in Philadelphia. I remember all the propaganda that it was as if you were recharging your phone battery, every time you got jabbed. And, that was a bad deal, even for those people who believed in the vaccines, because maybe the fifth one would get you real hard, where you were like Elon Musk and you thought you were going to die. But, it wouldn't matter. You'd still have to get the sixth, the seventh, no matter, how many. Fortunately, that whole thing fell apart. And CBDCs fall into that category because it's very similar. It's just with our money. You would have a centralized account with a central bank, no cash. And, you could already imagine, and I'm sure the tyrants have already imagined what they would love to do. If you're not into the latest social fad, perhaps they would freeze your account. Or, let's say they wanted to bail out a crony corporation, let's say a Bud Light or a Target. They do something stupid and they lose tons of money. Well, they could bail them out, and you log into your digital account and find out you have less money. The money went to bail out the crony corporations. They could also set time limits and say you have to spend this amount of money by a certain date. They could, to get you to spend money and prohibit you from saving money. The tyrannical things that could be done are endless. These are just a few. So you can see why they would want this. But like vaccine passports, I don't believe that it's doable, and I don't believe that it's going to happen, because black markets would form immediately. People would start to use their own currencies, barter. They would get around it in many, many ways.
When economies collapse, because if we continue at this rate, people laugh, and I don't want to believe it, but could we ever get to the point anything close to what happens in runaway inflation like in Venezuela and Zimbabwe? Germany did at one time, but we're on the road to it. And the reason why I fear it is it's different than ever before. There's never been so much control for a significant long period of time, where the whole world was distorted by a reserve currency that was totally fiat and printed by the government and the country that has the biggest empire, the biggest army, the most wealth, and they feel like there's no limit, even though the voices are getting louder and louder trying to warn. But still, I mean, even since the debt resolution, just recently in Congress, we'll we'll raise the debt limit and we'll cut down some spending. I think the debt has gone up $700 billion just since they had that resolution. So it really is a joke, and it's not going to be a joke though when the consequence comes. So that's why people have to consider it. Ultimately, I look at the big picture, and it doesn't result, because even the United States has gone through periods like this. They have to resort to some type of soundness, returning to the monetary system. Of course, the best thing is advancing a little bit further than we've ever been to a free market system where people make the decisions. People, the left and the big government people preach and stuff and say everything is democracy, democracy, democracy. The Constitution doesn't teach that. Democracy, the true democracy I like, is everybody has a vote every day. Every time they spend money, they have a vote on where the money's going to be spent. And even in this craziness with, both lockdown and also the people, the things like Budweiser, people are voting. They're voting with their money. That's probably what represents true democracy compared to the managed democracy that they talk about, where they just get enough people, enough special interests together to become a king of the mob, and then they take over the government. I'm afraid that's where we are today. There is this big spending, and it seems like it's unlimited, but the best thing to do is question. You have a right to question, even if they argue. You don't even have a right to say that. Just think of what they did to many people in the churches and the economists and the doctors, who sometimes all they said, I want to debate the issue. I want to debate which drug is best for COVID. And, cancel him. He's not allowed to talk anymore. Fire him. And doctors losing jobs and professors getting kicked out. But it's starting to shift because I think the most important thing that we maintain, if we ever expect to move the goalpost to our position, is that we have to have the right to speak out. because you have to be able to discuss what we have and challenge them. But when they lock down and say you can't even talk, and you'll be hearing about this, you wait and see if there's any candidates that won't be allowed to talk at all, or they'll exclude them, or they will avoid them, because truth really hurts, when there's an empire that is totally dependent on lies.
Well, my closing thoughts. Yeah, authoritarians do not want debate. Whatever they say is settled. I saw yesterday the big Supreme Court, saying that universities no longer have to judge people by the color of their skin. You'd think that the left would be happy with that, but of course not. And I saw Elizabeth Warren. She said that this is outrageous. They're going back against settled law. And I thought, settled law? These are man-made laws. It reminded me of what they said about settled science. Science is never settled, and man-made laws are never settled, for sure. They're man-made. The only settled laws are the truth, natural law, and for those of us who are religious, we believe in higher laws. Those are settled. But anything that are made by governments, they're never settled. They're man-made. Another man will come in and overturn it, just like they just did yesterday. So, but the authoritarian mindset is what they say is what it is, and that's how it's going to be forever. And it just doesn't turn out that way. Just because you can imagine some kind of utopian scheme does not mean that you can make it reality. Just because you could imagine vaccine passports or zero carbon or world government or CBDCs, what we're talking about today, life is very complex. Everyone reacts in their own way when government does something. You could picture it like a billiards game, at the very beginning where you break the rack of balls. They all scatter. You can't control how each ball is going to go, whether it's going to go into the pocket or not. Well, that's how it is with government laws. They imagine things in their mind, they make a law, and then all of humanity scatters in their own way to adjust to it, to adapt to it, to get around it, and the whole scheme falls apart. And we just keep repeating this over and over. And, we could avoid a lot of this if we just embrace the ideas of liberty and voluntarism and not have to go through all these schemes one after another. But, it takes a lot of work, a lot of education, a lot of speaking, like what Dr. Paul said, to get these ideas out so that we could at least nudge humanity in the right direction.